right, well, good morning again. Anybody like the show Stranger Things? Anybody? It's a great show. So that just came out, the season 2 this week. So I'm just going to talk for 30 minutes about Stranger Things. I hope you guys are okay with that. Totally kidding. I do love that show, though. But we're in a series called Tension that's been super helpful for me. Hopefully it's been really helpful for you. And Greg talked about in the first week how in this world there's a lot of problems, right? And there's a lot of people that are on missions to solve these problems, and that's a really good thing. But there are a lot of things in this world that aren't problems to be solved, but simply tensions to manage. And that's where we find ourselves with a lot of these things. And so in the first week, Greg talked about the tension between grace and truth. And we learned that Jesus came full of both, full of grace and truth, but we are left here to kind of manage that tension. What does that look like in our lives? We learned that too much truth will actually drive people away, right, and not allow for relationship, where too much grace will not allow us to speak truth into their lives. And so we have to manage that tension. We lead with grace, we build trust, we build relationship, and then we're able to speak truth into people's lives. And then last week, this is like totally subjective, but one of my favorite services that we've done at Stateline is we dove into the topic of faith and doubt. And Greg did a phenomenal job of talking about this, and Stephanie shared her story about her journey with faith and doubt as well. And we learned that doubt is all a normal part of who we are. And we learned that doubt is actually on the opposite side of faith. They're the part of the same coin. And that doubt is essential to our faith, essential for us to trust in God. And that God doesn't need a lot of faith, just a little bit, just a step in his direction. And he can do a ton with that. And if you've missed any of our teachings, but especially those two in this series, go back to the app, go online, please catch up. They were really helpful for me, and I know they will be for you as well. But this week, we get a chance to dive into the third tension that we're going to be talking about in this series, and that's the tension between love and boundaries. Now, if I'm completely honest, when we were talking about these topics, I knew that this was a helpful topic. I knew that it was a topic that we need to talk about, but it wasn't one of those where I heard it and I'm like, I can't wait to talk about that. But truthfully, the more that I dove in, the more I researched, the more I read, the more I started to get really excited personally, because I started realizing how much it affects me, how important this is for me, how I need to do a better job with this. And I am so excited to share some of what I learned with you this morning. A lot of the information that I've gotten for this teaching comes from an expert in the field named Henry Cloud. He's written a lot of books, but a couple books in this area. One's called Changes That Heal. Another one's called Boundaries. And so I'm just going to scratch the surface this morning on boundaries and love. And so if you want to dive deeper into this, please check that book, Boundaries, out, because it's an awesome, amazing book. But we as a culture, as a society, us in this room, we deal with boundaries all the time. We deal with them in a lot of different contexts. The first one is just very simple. It's the physical context. So if you're a sports fan, you know if you watch a football game, there is the boundary on the sidelines and in the end zone. That's the out of bounds line, right? That's the boundary. It says, this is part of the game. This is not part of the game. This is the rest of the world, right? If you step on that boundary, you're out of bounds. It doesn't count as a catch. It doesn't count as a run. That's a very physical boundary. And kind of like a weird thing about those boundaries is everything that happens within there is different than what can happen outside in the real world, right? So if you're at Walmart and you see two people getting a fist fight in the parking lot, what happens? They go to jail, right? You can't do that. If you're at the 50-yard line, you get in a fist fight with a grown man, you just get 15 yards and maybe you got to go hit the shower early. It's very different, right? The boundaries define what's inside and what's outside. We have fences to our yards. That's a boundary that says this is mine and that's yours. That's your tree coming into my yard. Please cut your tree back because it's in my yard. That's your dog digging under my side of the fence. Get that dog out of here, right? That's my Frisbee on your side. Can you please throw it back? It defines what is mine and what is yours. Up north, there's something called the boundary waters. North of that is Ontario. South of that is Minnesota. It's a boundary. If you've ever been to a zoo, there's a clear boundary of what is human and what is animals, right? And if you cross that boundary, you're either tiger food or destroyed by a hippo. Side note here as well, there's more hippo attacks in the world than shark attacks. Maybe you didn't know that. They're very dangerous. That's a very good boundary right there, to be between you and the hippo. Another one, this is a pet peeve. There are boundaries on the roads and in the parking lots, right? Clear boundaries. If somebody takes 1 1/8 of a parking spot, they've taken 2 spots, right? Anybody else like to park really close to them so they can't open their door? No? Just me? Yeah, we all need more Jesus, guys, all right? There's physical boundaries, but there's also these kind of abstract boundaries that we deal with. There's boundaries with the words that we use or the words we don't use. Boundaries with family and how much time we spend with our family or don't spend with our family. Boundaries with technology and what we watch or don't watch or listen to, don't listen to. Websites that we feel like are okay or not okay to go to. Boundaries emotionally, boundaries with our thoughts, with finances as we set budgets. There's boundaries all around us. But for this morning, as we're talking about love and boundaries, we're going to look at boundaries relationally and what that looks like in our lives. And so the way I'm going to define boundaries, again, coming from Henry Cloud and his expertise, is this. Boundaries are where I stop and you begin. Thinking of that from a relational context. Boundaries help us define what I'm responsible to and for and what you're responsible for. Boundaries are essential because what they do is they help keep the good stuff in and they keep the bad stuff out. They help us to keep in what's going to fill us and grow us and develop us into the people that we're supposed to be, and they keep out the things that are going to drain us and kill us over time. Now, as followers of Jesus, this idea of love is a big deal. And if you've followed Jesus for any length of time, you know that this is kind of like his thing. Jesus is about love. It's what he's all about. It's what he calls us to be about as Christians. So I want to talk about the love side of this for a second and kind of talk about what Jesus says about love. And he addressed this a few times in the Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm going to look at one time that he talks about it in the book of Matthew. And now you can read, you can follow along on the screens. If you have the app, you can open up to the notes. All of the scriptures are in there as well. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And now contextually, what's going on here is everybody kind of knows there's not an Old Testament or New Testament at this point. There's just the Testament, the Old Testament. They know what it says. They know that there's 613 different commandments in the scripture. So this guy's kind of putting them on the spot, saying, like, which one of the 613 is the most important? And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." And then he kind of throws a little curveball here. He says, "And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." So Jesus takes 613 commandments and he condenses it down to two. Jesus answered, what is the most important commandment, in a simple answer of saying, well, love God and love people. Love God and love people. Love people by meeting their needs, by caring for them. Love people by being a listening ear. Love people by picking them up when they can't pick themselves up. Praying for people. Showing up when other people won't. Love people by being a cup of cold water in Jesus' name. And so what happens is we read this, and there's kind of two different camps, two different extremes that happen. We either read this and we say, okay, I have to do everything I can to do this. I have to sell out 100% to love people, to love my neighbor as myself. I'm going to do everything I can, and we kind of throw caution to the wind and we disregard ourselves. Or the other thing that happens is we think that that's what we have to do, and we get completely discouraged. We think I have to do all this, and it's going to be so hard, and everything's going to fall apart in my life if I do this, so I'm just not going to do anything. We go to the complete extreme, but here's what I want to clarify. Never, ever once when you read what Jesus says or see how he acts, did he ever say that we have to love our neighbors even if it causes us to go into a suffocating amount of debt. He never says, love your neighbor as yourself, even if it causes marital problems. Love your neighbor as yourself, even if it drives you away from your family and you're absent from your kids. Love your neighbor as yourself, even if it causes job troubles. Love your neighbor as yourself, even if it leaves you so drained and so empty that you can't love anybody else ever again. It never says that. Never says love your neighbor as yourself if it drains you, causes physical sickness in your body. Jesus never ever calls us to love others in spite of ourselves, just to love others as we would love ourselves. And I think about it like this. I just think about myself, and I think, okay, so there's times when I get hungry, and there's times when I don't like being hungry, and so I feed myself. So what does that look like for other people? Maybe they're hungry. Maybe I could help feed them. There's times when I like people to listen to me and hear my thoughts and hear my feelings. Maybe other people are in the same boat. They want to be heard. There's times when I just need encouragement. I need people to lift me up and build me up. Maybe there's other people like that. There's times when, truthfully, there's more going on than I feel like I can handle, and I need somebody to step in and help me and pick me up. Maybe there's other people in that same boat as well. The truth is, though, all of this, love, boundaries, living for other people, helping others. This is something that kind of transcends just Jesus followers. This is something that I've seen in all walks of life, all demographics, all religious backgrounds. People who go one extreme or the other where they don't help anybody, or they help people so much and love people so much that they put themselves in the back seat and others in the front seat at their own detriment. And while love and boundaries, as we're going to talk about today, are both extremely important and both really, really good things, too much of either of them can be bad, as too much of anything can be destructive in excess. And so the tension lies between love for other people and boundaries. Because as I'm going to talk about today, I truly believe that we can love our neighbors as ourselves while still setting clear boundaries in our lives that protect us and keep us healthy. So what I want to do is start kind of with the totally love side, the people who have swung all the way to the love side, who have not set boundaries. So what does it look like if somebody is all the way on the love side? First thing is they would say something, maybe not out loud, but in their spirit of, I'm defined by how you're doing. And so somebody who's all the way on the love side would look around at their family or their friends or their coworkers, and their well-being and how they feel is defined by how everybody else is doing. What I do for you is worth more than who I am. Your approval is greater than anything. And sometimes all of these can swing into what's called codependency. Maybe you've heard that before. I've heard a funny way, codependency isn't funny, but I've heard a funny definition of codependency is like if you were to fall off a cliff and somebody else's life flashed before your eyes, right? Because you're always thinking about others. You're never thinking about yourself. Constantly saying, am I blank enough? Am I good enough? Am I smart enough? Am I enough? Too much love, people maybe have problems saying no. You know all the things that are going to happen if you say yes to this person. You know all the dominoes that are going to fall and collapse and the pieces that are going to fall apart behind you, but you look in front of you and you can't say no. And so you say yes, even though it's going to cause all of this chaos in your life. You do things for others that they could probably do for themselves. Now, these are just some of the indications that maybe people cheat too far to the love side. And let me just say, being obsessed with what other people think about you is the quickest way to forget what God actually thinks about you and says about you. The more we put other people's opinions and feelings and thoughts and emotions ahead of ourselves, the more we forget what God has already told us is true about us, that we are good enough, we are pretty enough, we are smart enough, we're just enough. And so what happens now if we swing too far to the boundary side? The opposite of too far love, but too far boundaries. Like loving people isn't your problem. It's actually putting up too many walls and stipulations and regulations on how you love. So if you're too far to the boundary side, it probably looks something like selfish comfort with zero impact on the world. If you're too far boundaries, maybe boundaries just become, they're not limitations, they're simply walls that just keep people out. We only love and serve our people, our closest family, our closest friends. Everybody that we don't know, that we don't like, is kind of outside of that wall, that barrier, that boundary, and we don't let them in. Maybe if you're too far boundaries, you're suspect of everybody's motives. Like, stop me if you've ever heard this, but there's a homeless guy, you walk out of a restaurant, and somebody says, I'm not going to give them $1 because they're just going to go buy drugs. All right? Because you're suspect. You're like, okay, and I'm like, well, what if we just buy him like a sandwich? Like, he'll just smoke the sandwich. I'm like, no, nobody's smoking sandwich. That's too far boundaries, right? But we're suspect. We're suspect of their motives. We have a difficult time trusting anyone, or maybe rest and comfort become the ultimate goal. So, here we are, right? In this tension, we have love, we have boundaries, both important. But which one's right? Galatians 6 says it really well. Galatians 6:2 says it like this. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. All right. So love people are like, there you go. We gotta carry people's burdens. That's our job. We're here to love people. We gotta carry everybody's burdens. But what happens is you read 3 verses later, same author, same thought. It's like an inch down on the page. And Galatians 6:5 says this, for each one should carry their own load. So now boundaries people are like, there you go. Everybody's responsible for yourself. You know, you have your load, I have my load. Everybody's going to carry your load. So which one is the correct one? How do we figure out whether we're supposed to love or put up boundaries? Love or boundaries, love or boundaries? Well, the answer, as you probably have already assumed, is both. And that's the tension. We are responsible to others, but for ourselves. And if you notice here, as I read the text, there's two different distinct words used here, right? There's burdens and load. Responsible for others' burdens, to others' burdens, and for our own load. And so there's two different words here for a reason. We're supposed to love others by caring for their burdens, but also to carry our own load. Now, have you ever heard a teaching where pastors will wow you with their knowledge and they give you the Greek and the Hebrew and the Aramaic of everything? It's like, okay, we get it. You studied it. Okay, so I'm going to give you the Greek word here. The Greek word for burdens is veros. And here's why I tell you that. Because what that means is excess weight. Burdens in the Greek means excess weight, more than you can handle. Here's kind of how we can think of it. The excess weight would be like a boulder. Something so big that has the potential to crush you. And so burdens are the things that outweigh our strength. And this is going to be different for everyone, right? Everyone has a different threshold of what they can handle and what's a burden and what's not. But the end result should be the same, as when we see somebody with a burden, with a boulder, something crushing them, it's our job to step in and help them shoulder that burden, to carry that burden. There's a story that maybe some of you have heard about a man named Aaron Ralston. He was hiking on April 26, 2003. He fell down a slot canyon in between two rocks, and an 800-pound boulder fell behind him and pinned his arm to the side of the wall. Aaron was pinned there for days, had limited amount of water, limited amount of food, rationing it, and eventually he started to try to cut his own arm off, but his blade was too dull. He couldn't do it, so he's like, I'm going to die. He filmed his last words on his camera and went to sleep. To his surprise, he woke up and he came up with another plan that he was going to break his own arm and cut in between the bones. And if you've ever seen the movie 127 Hours that depicts this event, you know that he was successful. He cut off his own arm. He survived. He's alive today. But this was a literal boulder. This was something that was more than he could handle, that basically pushed him to the verge of death. And if someone were to come by on a hike and look down and see him and recognize that he needs help, recognize that he couldn't healthily get out on his own, they would never look down and say hey, you got this, you're going to be okay, hey, just cut your arm off and you'll be fine, and then leave, right? Nobody would do that. They would look down, they would say oh my goodness, this person needs help. I'm going to either try to help them, I'm going to go get help, I'm going to help them get out from under this boulder. But only boundaries people, the example of that would be you look down, you throw them a knife, you say cut off your arm, and you get on your way. Where the only love people, they jump down without a rope, they land there, they put themselves in his place, they send him on his way, they cut off their other arm so that he could have it, just as an extra arm, because that's only love. Those are the extremes. But here's the thing, our job is not always to solve people's burdens. It's just to help. To get them to a place where their burden is something that becomes a load, that becomes something more manageable in their lives. So we're to carry others' burdens, but we're to carry our own loads. So the other Greek word is phortion, which means cargo, which means daily life, things that we should carry on our own. So if the burdens are the boulders in our lives, the loads are simply the backpacks. The things that we put on that can sometimes be heavy, that can sometimes be uncomfortable after a long period of time, but something that is clearly designed for me to hold, for me to shoulder, for me to handle. I imagine if I was on a hike with 20 other people and we all had our backpack with our gear, and I were to get about a mile on the hike and I were to take off my backpack and hand it to somebody else and just start hiking, they'd be like, wait a minute, I've got my own backpack. What are you doing? They carry your backpack, I'll carry mine. All 20 of us will carry our own backpacks. That's yours to carry. My son does this all the time. He's 3.5 years old. I just picked him up from school on Friday. My one son is 1.5, so he can't even carry his own head half the time. So I have to carry all his stuff. And then my other son's 3, and he has a backpack. And so I'm carrying 3 things for Chase and Reed. And I was like, Reed, you just put your backpack on, and then I can carry everything. He's like, I don't want to. You carry it. I'm like, no, you can. He goes, I can't. I'm like, yeah, you just stick your arms out, and then you're fine. It's meant to sit on your back. But he's like, I can't. You carry it. It's so annoying, isn't it? But here's the thing. There's love, there's boundaries. There's also kind of this weird category of people who constantly are taking their backpack off and handing it to people, saying, you carry it. I don't want to carry it. Just because you don't want to do something doesn't mean you shouldn't. Just because you don't want to carry your own load doesn't mean you shouldn't. It's our load to carry. Now, there's a story that Jesus tells called the Good Samaritan. And this week, I kind of read through it with the lens of love and boundaries, looking at it through that lens, and it was very, very helpful. So I want to read this story. I've got a couple thoughts on that. So I'm going to have all the slides on the screen again in your app. Just read along with me. I'm going to read the story of the Good Samaritan. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. Jesus is thinking, okay, he listens. He knows the teaching. He knows exactly what I said. Perfect. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Maybe a question a lot of us are thinking. Who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and he saw the man, and he passed on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and he saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you have. Which of these do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So this man was not only down and out, he was basically on the verge of death. This was clearly a boulder situation in his life. It's not something that he could physically handle on his own. So the Samaritan showed him love by helping him with the burden. But what I want you to notice about this story is this. The Samaritan got him to a place where he was being helped, where he was on his way to being in a situation where he could then shoulder his own load. And then he left. The Samaritan didn't stick around and do the 47 other things that this guy needed. He got him to a point where it wasn't a boulder situation, and then he left. He took up his own backpack, and he left. He loved him by being responsible to him, but leaving and being responsible for himself. And this is tricky, right? This whole tension is tricky. Love others, but keep healthy boundaries. Don't be too comfortable, but don't be too uncomfortable either. And that's why it's a tension. We're called to love others, but also not empty ourselves out so much that we can't love effectively. I've been around the church my entire life. I've been in ministry. This is my 10th year in ministry. And I have seen time and time again people say, oh, I'm supposed to love others. And they jump in 100%. And they go all in. And they throw caution to the wind, disregarding any boundaries in their life. And they love and they love and they love until they can't. I've seen it 100% of the time with people like this. They love until they have nothing left. And what was once a calling in their life is now killing them, beating them down. And oftentimes this leads to resentment and anger and frustration, and sometimes even stepping away from the church or away from God completely. But ultimately what it leads to is them not being able to love their neighbor as themselves for a season or sometimes even longer. But Jesus has called us to love. And to do that effectively, it's so important that we protect our heart. Proverbs 4:23 says it like this: above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. If your heart is protected, if your heart is pure and healthy, then good and pure love are going to flow out of it. But if your heart is beaten down, if your heart is abused, if your heart feels taken advantage of or discouraged, it's only a matter of time before your heart is not going to be able to pour out, before you're not going to be able to love your neighbor as yourself any longer the way that God has called us to. because our love should come from an overflow. But if you're constantly letting people poke holes in it and drain you, you're never going to be full enough to pour out on other people. And on the flip side, if you're all full up and you're full and not leaking out on anybody, that's not good either, because we are called to love. But here's the thing about all this. It's our responsibility and no one else's. It's your responsibility to love others. It's your responsibility to put clear boundaries in your life that allow you to do that effectively for a long time. Nobody else's. It's your responsibility to other people, burdens, and your load. And as I study Jesus and I read about him and I learn about him, it's obviously clear that he has the love thing down. He was love manifested, right? He loved people over and over in ways that a lot of us couldn't even imagine. But if you read the text and you study him, you see that he actually set very clear boundaries in his life. And these are trickier to see because oftentimes it's what he didn't do that is the boundaries that he set. So let me give you some examples. Jesus obviously had 12 followers, 12 disciples. But there were hundreds of people that were all about what he was teaching. Hundreds of fans, hundreds of people that would have loved to be a part of that 12. But he had a clear number. He said, this is my 12. That was a limit. That was a boundary. And even in those 12, there were 3 of his closest that would go away and pray with him. And I think the other 9 probably would think, hey, I wish I was part of that. But Jesus had a boundary. Jesus didn't do public ministry every second of every day. There were times when he pulled away, when he had solitude to recharge. That was a boundary in his life. There was one time he healed a blind man by putting mud over his eyes, and he had a boundary. He didn't even wash the mud off. He said, you do the walking, you walk to the fountain, you get your mud washed off. He had a boundary. He wasn't going nonstop. There were times when he walked, when he was relaxed, when he napped. It's a time when he napped in the middle of a storm. There's never, ever evidence that Jesus rushed anywhere. He moseyed. Jesus was a mosier. One time he took so long to heal the sick guy that he died. Now, obviously, Jesus had other intentions there, but he took his time. He had boundaries. Never once did Jesus cave to the desires of people that would compromise the mission that he was on. He had boundaries that put God first. And because of that, because of the boundaries in Jesus' life, he was able to accomplish more in the 3 years of ministry than most of us could accomplish in our entire life. And I get, he's God, right? He's got a leg up on us. But the evidence is clear. It's the boundaries in his life that helped him sustain his ministry as a human long term. Now, there's boundaries that we put from a relational context. And that's something that we have to figure out, right? What are the boundaries? Where are the boundaries? But there are very real boundaries that people have put in place to protect themselves. And I don't want to gloss over that. There's restraining orders. There's people that you don't allow yourself to see because emotionally it's too hard. There's family members that you don't spend a lot of time with because you know that it's just going to drain you. There's very real things going on in all of our lives where we want to and need to put boundaries. And I don't want to gloss over that and say that it's all lumped in. Some of them are different. So putting those very smart boundaries up in your life is good and healthy. And I don't want you to forget that. But as a follower of Jesus, we're called to love people. And so as we manage this tension in our lives, we have to evaluate. Some of us need to do a better job of putting those limits. Stop saying yes to everybody. Putting boundaries in our life that help us to stay full, to stay filled up so we can leak out into other people. But there are people in this room that maybe need to actually swing closer to the middle away from boundaries and start loving people and start making impact and start doing things for the kingdom and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And this is one of those things that's tricky because we can't wave a magic wand. We can't give you that quick 3-step thing to fix it. It's a tension that you and your spouse and your friends and your family have to constantly be managing. Whether to start loving people more, whether to start putting clear boundaries in your life and protecting your hearts. But that's the tension. To love and serve others, to love our neighbors as ourselves, but guard our hearts so we don't burn out, so that we can fulfill the calling that Jesus has put on every one of our lives. So we're going to sing a song together and kind of end this service by just reflecting on this. And we're all in a different boat here, right? We all have to reflect differently, but here's what I know. The one that can help us is Jesus. There's only one Savior of the world, and none of you are him. There's only one person that can shoulder everyone's burdens and everyone's loads. And one person that we should lean into for discernment in this topic, to help us with this. We need to look to the perfect example of love, the perfect example of boundaries, to figure out what does it mean in my life? What steps do I need to take to start figuring this out together? So would you stand with me and let's sing together. I'd love to just pray for all of you and then read a verse over you and then we'll be dismissed. So God, this is tricky. This is a tension. This is something that is worth managing because, Jesus, we know that you've called us to love people. You've demonstrated that for us. You've demonstrated for us the way you went to the cross. And so, Jesus, as we're trying to do a good job loving people but protecting our hearts as well, help us to just discern what's right, when to put boundaries up, when to limit our boundaries and love more. But God, as we go about this week, I pray that you just bring this to the forefront of our minds, of our conversations with our family, with our friends. God, make us extra aware this week of how we can do the best job possible of loving people and loving them for a really long time. It's in your Son's name, amen. Let me read this for you. May the Lord make your love increase and overflow for each other and for everyone else, just as ours does for you. May he strengthen your hearts so that you will be blameless and holy in the presence of our God the Father when our Lord Jesus comes with all his holy ones. Thank you guys so much. Have an awesome week.